Yeah, films. Yeah, films. We watched some films. Now let's talk about those films.
Today, very surprisingly, I am going to be talking about Wendell and Wild, which just came out. And again, I was just watching it for my leisure. I was like, I love claymation. I love Jordan Peele. I love Henry Selick. So I was like, sure, I'm going to watch this film. And then halfway through, not even halfway through, it was like 15 minutes in. And I was like, wait a second. Of course, I'm going to
Me
learn
too.
something.
The ratings that had themes. It's like, what's wrong with the themes? Like, it's a animated Jordan Peele show. And then 15 minutes in, I was like, oh, those themes.
Like, of course, but also what? Um, so Wendell and Wild is about two scheming demon brothers, Wendell and Wild, enlist the aid of 13-year-old cat Elliot to summon them to the land of the living, which is super deceptive. Like there's like that's what it's about. But is that what it's about? Um, and it is directed by Henry Selick, did Coraline, written by him, Jordan Peele, and it's based on a book by Clay McLeod Chapman. And I want to read the book now, but it was just something I was really excited to watch just because I really do enjoy claymation. I think it's a wonderful medium and I love the stylings of Coraline. And we've covered that previously. It's like it is our most watched and listened to episode, which is really crazy. I don't even remember what we said in it. It's just a popular film, right? And so this one was in harm of being swept under the rug. Like it was something that people were not talking about nearly enough. And I mean, coming out the same year as Nope, I can see people being like, "Oh, we just did a Jordan Peele," but it's like, but this isn't just Jordan Peele. Like people need to realize that. So definitely watch it. As always, there will be spoiler alerts throughout the my section, but it's such a quick watch. You'll enjoy yourself. It's on Netflix. Take a look. But what I found when doing research on this episode was that there are remarkably no horror movies overtly about prison. There are, films about being in prison. There's films that have themes you can connect to being imprisoned, but there's nothing that's like this is about being in prison. And I found that really interesting because horror is a genre that is often used to criticize real world horrors. And I was expecting to find no end to content options because of how intense and horrifying this specific topic is. I was like, of course, someone out there has it. I just haven't seen it yet. And furthermore, horror isn't a genre that shies away from truly horrifying issues, but it is hauntingly quiet about this specific one. And there are plenty of films about prisons, and it could be argued that the documentaries about our prison system are horror on their own because they are. And we have, covered them before. We even interviewed the director of Belly of the Beast, which is a horrifying documentary about the California prisons that were forcibly sterilizing women of color. We've even covered documentaries on our show before. It isn't always narrative work, thinking of the One Child documentary that we covered for population control. Not like it was partnered with a narrative film, but that was one of our biggest parts was talking about that specific documentary. And we worked really hard to find one to talk about specifically. And the thing about the horrors of America's mass incarceration system is that there is no one film that can truly cover it. It's a very complex system. There's so many parts of it that you can unpack and talk about. I can't imagine one film being able to do that. And so there's, Ava DuVernay's 13th does an amazing job of exploring the thesis behind Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, and both cover the racist and oppressive systems we find a large chunk of our population to be victims of. But even that felt like we were not getting the full picture. And even the film that we're talking about today also doesn't get the full picture. All of that's to say, there's this episode will most likely have another one to follow. I can't imagine us not recovering the issues and talking about other ones. I was going to go through the totally blanking on the name of the documentary series now, but there was like the three different documentaries about the boys who were like goth and got um, arrested for the murder of these young boys, and it was literally just because they were like the edgy goth kids.
Oh, during Satanic Panic.
Hmm.
Ah,
Yeah.
yes. The
And
highly logical and rational period of our judicial
like, oh, of
history.
course, they listened to Marilyn Manson, so of course they did this murder, and they were like 14. And so,
I mean, Marilyn Manson is an abuser
yes,
and an
obviously,
untrustworthy
yes.
person. However,
But listening to them
yes,
does not mean these
yes.
children who don't know that. Like, and it was, yeah, Satanic Panic for sure. And there's three films actually about like the team trying to work to combat them and like their trials and show that there was clearly not enough evidence and that it was them just judging this population. And then they eventually got out. Like I think that's the third one, but it really was one of those like films about the kind of like the armchair sleuths of the world, because they're like the
Yes.
first true crime. Like they had like a website for these boys to like try to get them out, and it was like the birth of people actually being on the internet and doing that.
Love it.
And
Love it.
so I wanted that was like my the first thing I was gonna do was cover that actually. And then I was like,
Ooh.
I definitely want to do a Satanic Panic episode. But I also felt like the three boys who were arrested, are white boys. And so that also wasn't telling all of the
Mm-hmm.
stories and also wasn't telling the stories of the people I know. And
Yeah.
so, again, I just want to explain how difficult it was to find anything to cover. So, hopefully this plus next week's episode will be a good introduction for you to really start questioning why we have the systems that we do. And I do very much encourage you to watch those films. I will get the name of them. It's like it's something paradise. And definitely watch 13th. Highly recommend.
Oh, yeah. If you haven't seen 13th yet, I don't even know what you're doing listening to this episode. Go watch 13th
Yes.
and then listen to this episode.
Yes, and cry, bring tissues,
Yes.
because you will, and read the new Jim Crow as well. I think it
Oh,
should be taught in
yeah,
schools always. So,
absolutely.
um,
Michelle Alexander is absolutely incredible researcher. Incredible.
absolutely, and it's heartbreaking, like what they find, and it seems like I think the heartbreaking part is it seems so obvious, but it's just that no one's
Yes,
looking. Like no one's
exactly.
like, huh, wait a second, and so I don't think there's one true answer to any of the issues just because it is such a complex and robust problem. um, Other than
Well,
like
I mean,
scrap it
I don't mean,
altogether.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but like that's one of the big critiques of the prison industrial complex, right? That it has one response to the myriad type of crimes, social ills, threats to public health, etc. There's one response, and that can't possibly
Yeah.
be effective.
Yeah. Yeah. I think and I think that's the answer is really just does this work? No.
Right.
So let's not do that anymore.
Right. Let's not do that. Let's.
Pick
Can
a
we not
different
imagine
thing.
something else?
Yeah. So I think abolition for sure, or just
Yep.
like we need to figure out where like these, and I'll explain that. And next week I have a guest who's really explaining it as well. That we are not addressing the real problems. We're not addressing the sources
Absolutely.
of these issues. Instead, we're just kind of glazing over them and causing more. And yeah, it's insidious, honestly. And
Absolutely.
our systems aren't built for rehabilitation. The
Correct.
people who are incarcerated are not given tools or education with the intention that once they return to society, they'll be able to live better lives. That's never the intent of this system.
Hmm.
The prison system isn't even a band aid, it is a weapon, it is a strategy. And the system works to get people, very specific people, in for profit and for control. And they make it impossible to get out and stay out. There's no end to what we could cover in this episode, so it's going to be very long, and it's been very difficult to plan for, because we could talk about how incarcerated people work for pennies, which can be
Yeah.
considered a new form of slavery or indentured servitude at the very least. We could talk
Hmm.
about how they are confined to spaces that are damaging to them physically, mentally, and spiritually. Studies have been done explaining the mental damage of folks institutionalized. There's a book I'll mention later as well that talks about some of the mental effects that people have when they come back. Pascal will be talking about some of those things as well.
Hmm.
And we could discuss the sexual assault or the overall assault and abuse on incarcerated people. We could talk about the stigma and demonization of people who are incarcerated. And therefore, people now are like, well, you're less than. So it doesn't matter what happens to you. We could again discuss the forced sterilization and other eugenics practices conducted in our prisons. We could cover our bail system, which is an oppressive tool that affects the lower class, imprisoning people because they are poor. And you'll also hear in next week's episode about how commissary prices have gone up. Like it
Mm.
just continues to get worse. Um, and so we could, and this was another thing that I was going to cover in this episode, just like walking everyone through where, like, why it took so long to get to this episode. I have been fighting very hard for it, but we could talk about Khalif Browder, who was
Yeah.
incarcerated on Rikers Island before he even stood trial, and during his time there spent 700 days in solitary confinement. And the damage was so severe and traumatizing that he took his own life 2 years after his release. We could talk about the other horrors of Rikers in and of itself and how it should be shut down. There's an op ed on News One titled Why is Rikers Island Still Open? And Why Won't New York City Mayor Eric Adams Accept the Help He Needs? Explains built to only hold 3,000 people, Rikers contains approximately 5,500 people, and the packed cells and worsening deaths, abuse, violence, and illness are also evidence of how cash bail has been weaponized against the poor to deprive them of their rights. And as of July 2022, over 20 people had died while incarcerated at Rikers this year. And mind you, Rikers is specifically a pre-trial detention center. Over 90% of those in the center are Black and Brown New Yorkers, and they are people who have not been convicted of a crime. Like, crime doesn't equal you should be treated this way. I want that to
Right.
be known. That doesn't mean that. But these people also have not been convicted of a crime. Like,
Yeah.
the
These folks have
arguments,
the presumption of innocence.
yeah. And the arguments that you could have by demonizing people who are incarcerated do not work here because
Right.
they're literally just because they cannot afford bail. And last year, it was even declared a humanitarian crisis. And like I said, you'll find ways in our ways to help section resources to support the campaign to shut down Rikers. It's going to be a really heavy ways to help section. Have your pick. Pick one thing. The year is not over. You could do your one
Hmm.
good deed. Okay. And honestly, your half of your good deed is listening to this episode and learning. Um, all of this and more can be unpacked about our toxic and abusive incarceration system. But this is the film analysis portion of our show. So let's unpack something that surprised me on my journey to find some horror prison content. So just a week before we set to record this episode, Kat and I decided to watch Jordan Peele and Henry Selick's claymation film, Wendell Wild. And of course, we knew that there was going to be more than whimsy to be found in Peele's film, but we weren't expecting this. It was like, I was like, what? So, as I explained, the film is about two demon brothers trying to get to the land of the living, and they use a young girl cat to do so. But this film, as always, is about so much more. Wendell and Wild, at its core, is about the school to prison pipeline in the prison industrial complex and for profit prisons. So, about a third of the way through the film, I said to Kat, this film is about prisons. And then Kat immediately found several articles backing that up like, while we were watching the film because I was like, wait a second. So Wendell and Wild is a hauntingly charming film with a beautiful cast of characters. I loved Wednesday, but I was really hesitant to watch it given Tim Burton's comments about how darker complexions don't work for his aesthetic. And this film
Mm, gross.
laughs. hysterically in that face. So it said, I'm sorry, what? Which complexions, which people don't fit into this like creepy and charming aesthetic? Because there are black characters, mixed characters, Latina characters, indigenous characters,
Indigenous
and
characters.
each one of them was so unique and wonderfully suited for the claymation medium. Like their faces were designed for that. Like it's so beautiful. And it really was a pleasure to watch. It's not a subtle film in the slightest, which we love a film that just tells you what's going on. It's like you can't pretend you don't get it. Right? Like we're not gonna tiptoe around any issues, which is just a very Peel thing to do. Even featuring a villainous character that is very much unsubtly stylized after Trump. He's got the
Yes.
hair, he's got the tie. It's like I was like, this
I
is
love
Donald
that.
Trump. And the demons of the film aren't even the villains. And the practice of interacting with those demons isn't even seen as villainous behavior. There is sympathy for them. And I'll explain, like, at no point is imprisoning in any form a good thing in this film. It's very much like nobody should be doing that, period, for profit or not. Like, it's just not. And the film could have easily resulted in another Haunted Towns episode because it does really show a town haunted by this prison industrial complex and how they lose, the heart of it because of these people who just want money. So Karen, Kat's parents run a root beer brewery, and it is the heart of the small town named Rust Bank. And they care about their community, and immediately that they are going to be Disney parents because they're just too good to be true. It's like as soon as they show themselves to be loving, and they're like on the phone, they're like, "No," and everyone's like, "Oh yeah," they're like a happy little family. I was like, "Oh no." RIP them already.
Mhm.
So they get Disney parents. And you find out that they are continuously offered deals by the Claxons, which the Trump esque man and his wife are the Claxons, and to sell their property to make way for a new prison. And her parents and the town council refuse. And after an accident on a bridge results in the death of her parents, we learn that the orphan cat has acted out in her different homes and now finds herself as part of a rehabilitation program called Break the Cycle back in her hometown. And when she arrives, the town is terribly changed since she was last here. Clax Corp, run by the Claxons, has taken over everything. And there was this terrible fire at the root beer brewery that resulted in the death of all the workers there and the eventual closure of the root beer brewery. And like all the revenue, like this was a factory town in a way, and now it's just cloudy and sad. Rest Bank is but a shell of its former self. And while at the school that hopes to fix her, or at least look good for trying, she discovers her connection to demons because Kat is known as a hell maiden and she can commune with demons. Which is like really cool because it's never really seen as like, oh no, she's evil because she's a hell maiden. It's like, oh, she's cool. That's like a superpower. It's like, oh, she
I
can.
know, I loved
It
that.
was just like, oh yeah, she's not the only one. It's a great thing. I was like, that's rad. That's rad. Um, these devilish brothers, Wendell and Wild, learning of her abilities, strike a deal with her to bring her parents back from the dead, and hijinks ensue because it's a child claymation film. And so the other students at the school are quick to want to be Kat's friend, including the annoying but sweet trio of popular girls led by Claxon's own daughter. And further, there's a trans boy, Raul, who becomes an unlikely
Oh,
hero and friend. And one of my favorite parts of this was that his identity was discussed a few times, but it never felt like a joke or problematic. It was
yeah,
very natural. You learn by context clues and just
yeah.
like by them defending him. So the school is an all girls school. And yet Raul is here. So it's easy to quickly understand his identity. And it reminded me of the Heartbreakers. The Heartbreakers? Heart Heartstoppers. Heartstoppers. Heartstoppers, the queer, really cute queer Netflix show. It's based on the graphic novels. But one of their friends, it's an all boys school, but one of their friends is a girl and she goes to a new school. But you learn that there's no trans. So I just love those where it's just like, oh, we don't. We don't have to talk about it. Siobhan Claxon misgenders him once and apologizes. Someone over the phone misgenders him and is corrected by his mother. And never once did Kat misgender him, nor did any of the villains. The demons often call
Hey,
him a boy. And I was like, enough said. Like, it was just like, it's that simple. It's literally that simple.
if demons can do it,
Yeah.
so can
Like,
you.
if, yeah, if demons can be like, look at this boy. Whoa, cool. What, how? And then, of course, his mom being like, no, no, I have a son. What? Amazing. Love it. So the Claxons hope to build a new for-profit prison and rest bank with small cells. This is to fit as many people as they can. And obviously not in I mean, prisons aren't humane to begin with. This is just even worse. And rest bank is so broken, they expect anyone who leaves the system will find themselves back in it. Like once they get out, what are they going to do in rest bank? More crime or whatever they think is deserving of putting them back in here. Further, the Claxons want to form their own second chance program, which will flood Cat School with youth leaving the incarceration system, hoping this influx of traumatized and troubled teens will overwhelm the staff, resulting in recidivism, because those people are not equipped to help these children who need very specific help. That's not what it's designed for. It's not to help them. It's not to help give them a new way of life or support system. It's just let's all put them in one place where they're just going to continue to get rowdy and feel invisible. And so this is all in hopes of becoming even richer. Period. And Pennsylvania has its own troubles with for-profit prisons, and I recommend another documentary, Cash for Kids, which is very unsettling and horrifying about for-profit prisons here in Pennsylvania and its juvenile system. It was really scary. It's like if I saw that as a kid, I would have been really like. There's this one kid who just like his parents bought him a bicycle, and it's just that they bought it from some other kid who had stolen it, and so then their kid just gets taken away,
Oh
and
my
they
god.
tricked all of the parents to not be there during their trials. Like
Oh my god.
insane. Definitely watch it, and again, bring tissues. Like if you want to get mad, I can give you a lot of documentaries about this. Um, in fact, this film being not subtle, this goal is so blatant that there's an entire conversation about it between Shaban and her parents, where she says, "Mommy, Daddy, I know the truth about your prisons," and they say, "What is that, Shaban?" Says, "Well, you make a pile of money for every prisoner you take. So you pack them in like sardines, provide crap food, crap medical, dangerous conditions, and zero rehabilitation." And the dad says, "I'm so proud of you, dear." And they say, "That's our business model exactly." As if it's a good thing. But it's literally in your face. So the biggest takeaway I found for this film was understanding the villains. Because at first you were to believe Wendell and Wild or even their follow Buffalo Belter are the villains. The brothers lie to Kat and work to manipulate her into getting what they want. They want to fund. They want funding to build their own amusement park, and their father imprisons them to, they believe, keep them from changing the current park system he runs for torturing folks. It's a kids' film. It's got amusement parks in it. All right. Um, and however, the brothers become allies in the fight against the Claxons, and we learn their father was worried the brothers would come to the surface and be lost forever. And this is because all his other children, his other demons, were missing after coming up here. And we learn they'd been, you guessed it, imprisoned in capsules by a demon hunter and school staff person, Manberg. And eventually he releases them in the end for in exchange, and even these demons deserve freedom.
Mm,
It's like I was like, this is such a
mm,
beautiful film, and in the end, it's a community coming together and fighting against this evil. It's feeling very vampires versus the Bronx, and
yes.
just super charming in that way, and just beautiful for them. Like they were always together, and such a great like system of people being there. And so for summarizing my section of nonsense, mostly me just complaining about how I can't really have a section, is to say that our incarceration system isn't broken. Okay? It was built this way for a reason, to oppress and for profit. And our systems do not encourage or equip those incarcerated with tools for rehabilitation. It segregates entire populations and relies on recidivism. Our systems are not addressing the causes or core issues of crime. It does not seek to prevent crime because it can profit off of it. It can continue to oppress because of it. And when Henry Selick chose to make the Claxons and their prisons the true villains, he was telling us that we need to focus on returning citizens, that the real horrors aren't in hell at all, but rather right here.
There's a lot of talk about putting more cops in the neighborhoods hardest hit by gun violence. We've been doing this for decades. Think about it for a second. Over the past 40 years, we've increased police budgets across the country by over $70 billion. And we haven't put a dent in street violence in major cities around the country. One problem with that equation in the first place is that cops are around to react to situations and deal with the aftermath, not to prevent them in the first place. Imagine if instead of sending more police into an area, we mobilized resources to the zip codes hardest hit by gun violence. The problems our communities face with gun violence are a result of race and class-based structural inequalities, not moral failing. A lot of gun violence springs from people in poverty filtering into the drug economy in pursuit of a middle-class standard of living. By diverting money from the police to the community, we could create guaranteed livable wage job programs fixing up and beautifying the neighborhoods hardest hit by gun violence. Imagine if kids being tempted to work on the corner had the option to work a good-paying job fixing up their neighborhoods. They could clean up litter and illegal dumping, help with minor home repair for the elderly, and help beautify the public spaces in our neighborhoods. As part of this emergency mobilization of resources to the zip codes hardest hit by gun violence, we could also extend rec center and library hours in those neighborhoods, so young people have positive places to go. We could also hire trauma counselors to help people heal and to help us break free from cycles of violence. We could treat gun violence like the public health problem that it is. Instead of investing in policing our people, let's invest in helping them.